So we talked about this feeding of the 5,000. We'll finish that up, and hopefully we'll get through. Yes, yes. Hopefully we'll get through the um, walking on the water as well. And so we talked about the importance of the miracle, how it's the only miracle of Jesus that's recorded in all four Gospels, and that it was performed for so many people, and it was a miracle of creation rather than restoration, although any miracle, of course, is wonderful. And it's a picture of Christ as the bread of life. And then we talked about the occasion of the miracle, that it was during a time of rest for Christ, and he did it anyway. He served anyway, even though it was supposed to be a time of rest. And it was near the time of Passover. And then it talked about the failure of Philip and Andrew. I think that's being a little harsh, but what Philip and Andrew were doing was looking at their circumstances, not looking to Jesus, not looking to their Lord who was sovereign over those circumstances, but looking at the circumstances. We're going to have to steal a little boy's lunch to try and feed 5,000 people. That's not possible. And so they were living, I think the last thing I told you is they were living as virtual atheists in that sense. If we are looking at our circumstances and freaking out about those circumstances, let's take something like finals coming up, right? And if you're freaking out about that, instead of looking to the Lord who is sovereign over those things and is doing a good job to prepare for those, if you're not going to prepare, then Jesus isn't going to bail you out. But there's no need to freak out. God's got this. You do your part in studying for them and trust Him. So then let's talk about the miracle itself. We're going to read verses 10 to 14. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill. So I've heard theologians say that this wasn't really a miracle. People had food with them. Everybody took out their food. They shared, and everybody was fed. That's not what it says. Or everybody just got a little piece. That's not what it says. It says that they ate until they were full from these 5 loaves and 2 fish. So everyone had their fill. So when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet, the Messiah, who has come into the world." Listen, it had to be a miracle, because if everybody ate their own lunch, this wouldn't have happened, right? They wouldn't have tried to make him king. They wouldn't have said, "This must be Messiah." So it's important. The most important thing about this miracle is not actually the miracle. It's the person who performed it. The most important thing about it is Jesus. So we need to ask what we always ask in this Gospel of God. What does this miracle tell us about Jesus, about who Jesus is? Well, first of all, it reveals Christ's sovereignty. You understand this word sovereignty? What's another word for sovereign? A sovereign, like a noun. What's another word, David?
Self-governing.
Well, no, it's more than that. Yes. What?
He's reigning.
No. The noun sovereign. Yes. No, not holy. It means king or queen. The sovereign of England is the Queen of England. Is Queen Elizabeth II. She is the sovereign. To be sovereign means to rule completely. So we see Christ's sovereignty. We see that he is in total control. And we see this in 2 ways. First, no, it's not a third. First, we see it in his omniscience. He knows what's happening. He knows what Philip and Andrew are thinking before they even say anything. And he also knows what he's going to do. And that's the second thing, that he had knowledge of what he was going to do. So we see it in that as well. He knew he would feed the 5,000, and he was in total control of this situation. And then this requires, the miracle requires man's obedience, right? And he says to them, distribute the food. Have people sit down. He says, have people sit down and distribute the food. If the disciples would have said, no, I don't want to do this. We can't feed you this, and walked away, they wouldn't have been part of this miracle. So it was also a test of the disciples' obedience to a certain extent. Jesus was asking them to do something kind of crazy, right? We're going to feed these people, 15,000 of them, 15,000 of them, so have them sit down. And they could have been, you're crazy, I'm out of here. But they didn't. They obeyed. God had spoken, and even though they didn't understand it, they obeyed. Even though it didn't make sense, they obeyed. Has that ever happened to you where you know what God is calling you to do, but it seems a little crazy, or it seems not to be what you want to do? That happened to you? It's happened to me. And guess what you do? You obey anyway. A number of years ago now, I always forget when, but it's, I think, 2014, maybe 2013, somewhere around in there. And I had been teaching Bible study at my church. I'd been writing and teaching Bible studies for the women at my church for 13 years. And about November, God said, it's time to lay it down. It's time to stop. And I was like, what's wrong with you? No, it's not. I've got all these women that are being blessed by this, and I'm using my gifts for you and glorifying you. Why would you tell me to stop? By the way, your grandmother was in that Bible study. And she's not my harshest critic, by the way. It just didn't make sense. So I thought, that can't be God. That can't be God. I went throughout the Christmas season, and God kept saying the same thing. Lay it down. Lay it down. Lay it down. And I realized shortly after Christmas that I was dangerously close to arguing with God. And that is not a good idea. That never works out well. And so I knew that it was time to stop teaching Bible study. I had no idea why. None whatsoever. In fact, I remember I was teaching Mark, and I was teaching on, it was the second week of Bible study, so it was in January. And I was teaching on the disciples dropping their nets and following. And at the end of the lecture, I said, ladies, I have to tell you something. God is calling me to lay something down. He's calling me to lay a net down. And it's a net that I love. And it's Bible study. And he's calling me away from it. I have this sense that God has something for me. But I have no idea what it is. But what he's telling me is I can't say yes to that until I say no. It didn't make sense to me. All I knew is that I needed to obey. So I went through that semester. I taught Mark. And the day after I stopped teaching Bible study on a Tuesday, that Wednesday, I arrived on campus at La Platte to student teach for 3 weeks because I was trying to get my license back so I could continue to teach Mary and Anna and Malin and Caleb and Kyle PE because I was enjoying that. And so I wanted to be able to do that. I thought that's what I'd be doing. So I called myself the world's oldest student teacher. So I student taught for 3 weeks. And you know what I found out? I loved it. I loved being in the classroom again. I loved hanging out with teenagers. And at some point I went to the teacher workroom and they had the schedule up for the next year. And where Mrs. Hanson's name should have been, it said middle school teacher. And my first thought was, oh no, Mrs. Hanson is retiring. The kids will be so sad. And my second thought was, I want that job. I didn't ask for that job. And the reason I didn't ask for that job, I knew part of it was social studies. I have a social studies degree. I knew I was qualified to do that. The other part was English. I don't have an English degree. It was the same curriculum I taught my own children when they were in middle school. So I knew I could do it, but I wasn't technically qualified. So I didn't say anything. A few days later, Mrs. Schrock called me into her office and said, we want to offer you Mrs. Hanson's job, teaching middle school social studies and English. And I said, yes. She said, and you might want to go home and talk to Jeff and pray about it. And I said, okay, I will. See, that's what God had for me. And all along, what he had for me was this, was teaching high school Bible. And I knew that from the day I started. Mrs. Schrock knew that from the day I started. So I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I didn't know why God was calling me to lay it down. It didn't make sense to me, but I just obeyed. I would love to tell you that all of my stories are that way. When God tells me to do something, I just obey. But I don't. But here's what I do know. Obedience comes with blessing. A blessing comes with heartache comes with just obey. Just obey. And that's what they did. And blessing came from it. Now, this next one, write it down because you have a blank. But just like Christ's manliness, this isn't the important thing. That he had them sit down in groups and it was orderly, that's fine, but that's not what's important. Here's what's more important, is that it reveals Christ's omnipotence, his power, his all-powerfulness. Christ is able to do whatever he desires to do. He will accomplish his purposes, and he often uses the weak and the smallest things to bring those purposes about. Moses' tears in a basket moved the heart of Pharaoh's daughter so that Israel might be released from slavery. David's sling slew a giant that brought victory to Israel. He takes little things and he uses them to do great things. He takes people like you and like me to fulfill his purposes. And what a privilege that is, that God chooses to use us for his glory and for his purposes. And it shows the blessing that comes from serving. I'm sure that Philip and Andrew, the rest of the disciples, are like, Jesus told them to all sit down, and Jesus told them to, told us to give them this food. It's going to run out after about the third person, but let's just, and I'm sure they were like dragging their feet, but they obeyed anyway. And that meant that they were able to see the blessing, and they even, who spent time with Jesus all the time, saw something new, saw something more about Jesus. There was so much food that there were 12 baskets left over. Now, we don't know for sure, but that may signify the 12 tribes of Israel. But what we do know for sure is that it shows Christ's sufficiency. He is enough. He is enough for you. He is enough for me. There's a lie out there that says this: you are enough. I'm here to tell you, you are not. I am. We are all dirty, rotten, deserving of hell. If we think that, if I think I am enough for everything I need, I'm going to be sorely disappointed. My life is going to tank because I am not enough. That's the bad news. The good news is Jesus is enough for me. He is all that I need. Now, you may have heard about another miracle, a similar miracle, called the feeding of the 4,000. It's It's delineated. That is told in 2 of the 4 Gospels. So let's look at how they were different just a little bit. You've got the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Well, the first thing you see is that there was a different number of people. 5,000 in the one we've just talked about, that's in all 4 Gospels, and 4,000 in the one that is recorded in Matthew 15 and Mark 8. So they're different. This isn't the same story being told again. There's a different number of fish and loaves, 2 fish and 5 loaves, as opposed to a few fish and 7 loaves. There were different kinds of baskets. The basket of the feeding of the 5,000 was a kophanos, which was a small hand basket with no handle. And it was a spurus in the feeding of the 4,000, which was a larger basket that had a handle. The kophanos was used almost exclusively by Jews. The spurus was used almost exclusively by Gentiles, which makes some theologians believe that that feeding took place on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, where the Gentiles. And if you go to Israel today, you can find 2 churches that may be near the place of each of these feedings. And this is a picture of them. They're churches that have tiled floors. And this is what is in the title. They are commemorating this feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And then both had baskets remaining, but they were different numbers. 12, and I said that might mean the 12 tribes of Israel. We don't know for sure. 7 baskets in the spurs. 7 is the perfect number. It may be the number of perfection or completion. That may be why there were 7. We can't know that for sure. We can't even know if the numbers are significant. So that's the feeding of the 5,000. Now let's talk quickly about the miracle of walking on the water. When the people saw the sign, so the feeding of the 5,000 that he had done, they said, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. We read in Mark that it's kind of a chaotic scene, obviously. They're trying to make him king. And John said, Jesus says, "Go get in the boat, go, I'll beat you there." And he escapes and goes into the mountain, goes up on the mountain. And later in the night, he comes down from that mountain. And it says, the sea became rough because the strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So this is also a miracle, that Jesus was walking on the water. The people want to make Jesus king. That's the first thing we read, that they want to make, I'm not going to I guess. So the people saw the sign that he had done, and they said, "This is the prophet." And perceiving that they wanted to make him king, Jesus withdrew to the mountain. So they want to make him king. How does Jesus respond? Runs away. Gets out of it. Now, who of you, if somebody was wanting to do something, make you more important, or if Kyle hits the winning shot and they want to carry him off on their shoulders right after the win, how many of us would go and run away from it? Jesus did. Jesus knew that wasn't God's plan, and so he ran away from it. They were wanting to make him king for the wrong reasons. They weren't looking for a Messiah. They weren't looking for someone to take care of their sins. They were looking for someone who would overthrow Caesar. He can multiply food. He could probably defeat Caesar. That's what they were thinking. And Jesus knew that wasn't why he came. So Jesus is walking on the water, and it troubles the disciples. The disciples are in trouble. The disciples went down to the sea. They got into the boat. They started to cross Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of a strong wind blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. This is still true on the Sea of Galilee. That especially the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, it can be calm and sunny, and boom, it's a churning sea. And that's what happened as they rowed from somewhere to the west or east to the west at Capernaum, somewhere in that northern Sea of Galilee. It became a churning mass. And that's because over here on the western side, we've seen this picture before, is this cavern, this mountain with this gorge in between. And the winds come through there, and they begin to whip through there. And you can see the Sea of Galilee in the background, and especially the northern part of the lake. And so they are hit with one of these flash storms, one of these windy storms in a matter of minutes. And remember that these are fishermen, and they are frightened by this storm. They were used to storms on the Sea of Galilee, but this one was particularly bad. And so they're rowing against the wind, and they're not getting there, and they're afraid. And so within a few hours of this huge blessing of the feeding of the 5,000, they're facing this dark test. That can happen to us too. We can be on top of the world, and then something happens that blindsides us and knocks us down. But they just keep on rowing, even though they're afraid, until the Lord saves the day. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to him, "It is I. Do not be afraid." They were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. That last part may have been another miracle, like they just arrived immediately. It may just be that they were able to go quickly because the storm was gone. Here's what I want you to know. In Mark, when it tells this story, it says Jesus was coming out on the water, and he was about to pass them by. And it makes it sound like in the English that he was going to run ahead of the boat, like he was going to run alongside the boat and pass the boat. We have a family tradition that when somebody comes to visit and they leave, the whole family goes up on the street and runs along with the car and waves, and we go, our neighbors think we're crazy. Goodbye, I love you, goodbye. And we all wave to the person or the family that's leaving. And it sounds almost something like this, like the boat's there and Jesus is going to be like, look at me, I'm walking on the water. Does that sound like Jesus? No, it doesn't. That term, pass by, is the same term that is used in the Old Testament. It says, and God passed by. And everywhere where it says, and God passed by, there's a purpose for it. One example is when Moses said, I want to see the Lord. And God said, well, we can't do that because you'll die. But here's what we'll do. We'll put you in this cleft of the rock. I'll put you in this cleft of the rock, and I will allow my glory to pass by. Everywhere in the Old Testament, when it says the Lord passed by, same word, God is about to reveal something new about himself. And in Job it says, only God walks on water. These were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. Jesus was walking on the water, not just because it was the way to get to his disciples and to help them and to calm the storm. Jesus was walking on the water to reveal something of himself to his disciples, just as God did. And in so doing, he reveals something of himself to us, that he is the Christ, the Son of God. And then he says to them, don't be afraid. It is I. In the Greek, those words are this. Ego, I mean. I am Yahweh. He says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Yahweh, I am. Jesus said that so that his disciples wouldn't be afraid and so they would understand who he is. And John wrote it so that we too would understand that he is God. He is the Christ. We sometimes look at this miracle of Jesus walking on the water and think, that's not that great a miracle. Yes, it is. Only God treads on the water. And Jesus is God. And he deserves our very lives. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for this lesson, these miracles of Christ that show us who he is. I ask, Father, that you would make us just so in love with Jesus that we want to give him everything about us. He is enough. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Okay, the last thing we're going to do, and I think we have just enough time to do this, is to take this quiz together as a class. You'll need to have this to help study for your final. So I want to make sure you have the answers. Okay, number one. Approximately how much time passed between the end of John 5 and the events of John 6? Your curriculum says 1 year. You can go ahead and put that down there. We don't know. The true answer is we don't know for sure. We don't know what the feast was in John 5. You will never see that question again, obviously. Most of the book of John deals with which portion of Christ's ministry? Yes. It's C, the last third. John from the beginning is pointing the laser beam on Christ's death and resurrection, and so that's where he pays the most attention in his chapters as well. Peter and Andrew failed Christ's test of them because they failed to what? Exercise faith. See. Again, another question that's not that important, and you won't see it again, I'm pretty sure. The fact that Christ had people sit down in groups before he fed them reveals his A, orderliness. You'll remember that one. The fact that Christ had the disciples gather the leftovers reveals the importance of Christian stewardship of resources. B, also true, but again, not the most important thing. Of all the miracles, only one is recorded in all four of the gospel by all four of the gospel writers. What is it? The feeding of the 5,000. That one you want to remember. And then the last question is explain why Christ left the crowds and went to the other side of the sea. So I'm going to read to you what I wrote and have you write that down. The people, meaning the people at the feeding of the 5,000, wanted to grab him and make him king. Wanted to seize him, maybe is a better word, and make him king. Make Jesus king. Jesus knew that couldn't happen. It was not time, and he was not going to be made king now. So Jesus knew that couldn't happen. Because the people wanted to make him king for the wrong reasons. Jesus knew that couldn't happen because the people wanted to make him king for the wrong reasons. Now, you don't need to write this part down, but Jesus came as a suffering servant when he came the first time. He will come as a conquering king someday. But that wasn't his purpose when he first came. Questions? Okay, that's it. Chat.
Are we playing Jesus on Monday?
I think we'll play it on Friday. Bring stuff to study tomorrow, whatever, Bible or whatever, but become ready to study tomorrow.